One Piece just might be the most consistent thing in my life. For context, I grew up in the 90s watching all of the Toonami anime on Cartoon Network. Some of the titles I remember loving were shows like Sailor Moon, Gundam Wing, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Dragon Ball Z, probably the most popular anime of all time. I had no concept of how big manga and anime were in the East at that time. I didn't even know they were different from the cartoons I watched. I just knew that they were so cool that I rushed home after school to see the episodes so that I could talk about what happened the next day with my friends. I started reading manga in secondary school. That's high school for the Americans, sometime around 2007 or 2008. My first manga was recommended to me by a classmate. It was Shield 21, a shonen sports manga that chronicled the transformation of Kobayakawa Senna, a timid high school freshman with no friends, no passions, and no clear goals. Despite his unremarkable beginnings, Senna possessed an untapped, extraordinary talent that, when harnessed, propelled him to become his school's star athlete and their key to athletic glory. It was thrilling just as much as it was bizarre, and it was as funny just as it was inspirational. There was something about the storytelling that I had not experienced before. It was also about American football. Yes, American football as we call it everywhere else but America. Amusingly, as someone who did not grow up in the US and didn't care too much for watching any sport, I loved it and now love the sport because of it. As everything I know about that sport in particular comes from the lessons that Senna was taught as he was dependent on to take his team to victory, playing a sport he knew absolutely nothing about. It was his speed that made him special. Everything else, and to an extent, even that, was earned through hard work. It's that same hard work and perseverance to achieve your goals that defines most, if not all, of the shonen manga and anime I've perused through since, and probably what makes these stories so captivating. No matter how bizarre the characters, the settings, the conflicts that are contained in anime or manga, the idea of pursuing one's dreams is relatable to us all. After Shield, I picked up Naruto. At the time, it was still ongoing and I loved it. I then read and caught up to One Piece, which I also loved, and then, when I caught up to that, I read Bleach, another extremely popular title of the time which immediately shot up to being my favorite. Naruto, One Piece, and Bleach are commonly known as the Big Three, a title bestowed upon three of Japan's weekly Shonen Jump magazine's featured manga for their popularity and success. They were set to fill the void left by Dragon Ball when that series ended and reinforced manga and anime's popularity in the West. Bleach was my favorite of the three because it was faster paced and had some of the coolest and drippiest looking characters I've ever seen in anime, which still holds true today. But neither Naruto nor Bleach remain consistent. At this point, both Naruto and Bleach have been completed for almost a decade, but at some point, they just weren't as good as they were before. Things started falling apart. Plot holes, uninteresting and sometimes convoluted storylines, characters who showed initial promise that became neglected, and worlds that didn't seem as well thought out as the only story that is still continuing today. One Piece stood the test of time and continues becoming better with each new chapter. Now earlier I mentioned One Piece's consistency in my life, and I can be more specific. For one, Weekly Shonen Jump is a magazine that, as you may have guessed, publishes weekly. Aside from the occasional holidays and breaks taken by Oda, the mangaka who authored these stories, Oda has been continuously building an ever-evolving and ever-developing world for the past 28 years. I have been reading a chapter a week for over 15 years as each new one is released. Reading One Piece was a ritual that was so ingrained in my routine that I didn't notice until October 8th, 2022, when I traveled 40 minutes by train to watch the One Piece takeover of New York's Times Square's multitude of screens. For context, nothing other than my closest family or friends could convince me to go to Times Square on a regular day, and especially not when there was a special event happening. But here I was, for One Piece. I realized, however, I had nothing to show for it. I had no One Piece merchandise, and I had no physical volumes of the manga because I did all my reading online. In fact, I'm not sure if anyone other than my anime friends even knew I cared so much about One Piece in the first place. At the time, it was something I just did and did not think about, like how one may cook Sunday lunch or make their bed every day. It was routine to read the chapter as it came out every week and then discuss with my 2 or 3 friends who were also up to date and following the story as I had been for as long as I had been. This acknowledgement of One Piece's long-time, non-tangible existence in my life hit me hard. It even forced me to reflect on whether I really knew the story as much as I did, because frankly, I had not revisited the beginning, in manga format at least, since the first time I started over 15 years prior. So I decided to begin my journey again by purchasing volume 1 of the manga and reading everything again all the way through up until the last available physical volume. That is when I truly realized how special this story was to me and why I am unable at this point to go a day without thinking about it in one context or another. One Piece is currently over 1100 chapters long in the manga and has almost as many episodes of the anime. Many people want to start One Piece because of how much attention it's gotten recently with its recent animation upgrades, the most recent film, the new live-action Netflix series, the several pop-ups and collaborations it has had with well-known brands like Vans, Puma, Roblox, Lego, the Boston Red Sox, and the LA Lakers. Luffy, the main character, has had his own giant balloon at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade for the past 2 years. However, many are intimidated, and rightfully so, by the sheer amount of time it would take to read or watch the entire series. Most people I already know who already like anime have never even tried manga. And so although it is arguably the quickest and personally my favorite format of consuming the story, they probably wouldn't start with this giant. The anime is even more time consuming and frankly sometimes suffers with pacing issues, and Toei, the animation studio that produces One Piece, has their sometimes blatantly obvious biases for and against certain characters that I don't always appreciate. However, I think people think of One Piece as something they have to finish, something that they need to catch up to, and so are thinking of the time it'll take to complete as opposed to a journey filled with so many emotional and joy-filled moments that they can sit down, relax, and enjoy at their own pace. Coincidentally, that is exactly what One Piece is. A journey with characters and a world that grows with you. One with unforgettable perspective-shifting moments that can go from drowning your eyes with either tears of joy or tears of sorrow. It starts seemingly focused on what should be a basic story of one boy, Luffy, whose goal is to become the king of the pirates. But Oda's storytelling shows us that there's so much more to this story than just a boy and his dream. In fact, one of the most beautiful things about it is the fact that Luffy isn't the only one with dreams. Everyone in One Piece has dreams, just like every one of us in the real world has something we want to accomplish, someone we want to be, some place we want to explore. People who have never read or watched the story ask, how has he not found the One Piece yet? How is it not boring? Well, it's because Luffy's journey to accomplishing his dream isn't a simple one. He meets others along the way who either align with or challenge him and his values. These others, unlike most stories, continue to grow with Luffy and have their own challenges and form their new alliances along the way. Luffy impacts the world as much as the world has an impact on him, and the ripples are felt throughout. Every character is on their own journey, and Oda never lets us forget that. In the manga, he even takes the time to keep us up to date on characters who are no longer relevant to the current arc by illustrating mini stories on the cover pages of each new chapter. From foes to friends to fodder, there is a character for everyone in One Piece. Just looking at Luffy's pirate crew, they are an extremely diverse group of characters who all contribute something to the ensemble. There is a crewmate for every taste: smart, funny, introspective, shy, determined, brave, cowardly, crazy, mature, childish, cute, pretty, handsome, hot, ugly, scary, patient, muscular, skinny, dead, alive, tall, short, fat. We have it all. Every one of them is traveling with Luffy because, like him, they have their own dreams and they know that with each other's support, they can achieve them all. Oda also helps us understand these characters further by sometimes separating them into smaller groups, forcing them to adapt based on where they are and who they're with. The cowardly characters become more brave when the stronger characters aren't around to back them up. The wild characters are sometimes forced to be more reserved when the more responsible and/or strict characters scold or reprimand them. Sometimes, characters have the most minute interactions in the background of a scene or manga panel, which may seem extremely insignificant, but actually adds so much color to who these characters are. Actually, I'll give you one of them right now, just as an example. In a section of the manga between chapters called the SBS, Oda sometimes answers questions that he receives through fan mail. In the SBS of volume 35, here's one of the questions asked by someone who wrote to Oda. They say, I would like to ask you something, Odachi. In the first panel of page 21 of volume 33, why does Robin give Chopper her half-eaten cotton candy? This makes it an indirect kiss. If she wasn't going to eat the whole thing, she shouldn't have started at all. Oda responds, look back 2 pages. Nami-san, they're selling cotton candy, says Sanji as he brings back 2. These are, of course, for Nami and Robin. It would be unladylike for Robin to take it and give it directly to Chopper, so she shows good manners to Sanji by taking a bite first before handing it over. That is the level of detail and care Oda takes in crafting his story. Something the average reader could have completely glazed over is actually used to develop and affirm our ideas of all 4 characters involved. Sanji being a lover boy who is willing to exercise every love language, especially gift-giving, for the attention of his female crewmates. Also Nami, who accepts, tolerates, and sometimes takes advantage of it. Robin, who is the eldest and most mature in this interaction, accepts and tolerates, but is mostly just polite and thoughtful, and so will not hurt Sanji's feelings by saying no, but will say thank you and then give it to someone who would appreciate it more, Chopper, when Sanji's not looking. And there are many more instances of these subtle things Oda adds to this story, which he doesn't really have to, but makes the characters feel so much more human, relatable, and realistic. The villains are just as diverse and interesting. Some being completely unforgivable, and some, with some time, might just become your favorite character. We usually get at least one backstory every arc that focuses on the history of a relevant character and how they have been affected by their circumstances and the environment they grew up in. These backstories aren't just reserved for the good guys though. Some of the villains get them too, yes? There are villains who are just all-round rotten, but there are some who were groomed by someone even worse. Those who went through their own hardships, those who were oppressed, and as a promise to themselves to never be oppressed again, became the oppressors. Some aren't villains at all, but whose reputations have been deliberately sullied by rumors that are exacerbated by the influence of the authorities who started them. Another one of my favorite things about One Piece's villains is how early on they're established. Many other series wait for a new arc to introduce the big bad of that arc, then and there. The new strongest foe yet, who for some reason we've never heard of up until now. Apart from One Piece's introductory episodes, every antagonist is hinted at way before, sometimes hundreds of chapters prior to the arc where they become the main focus. Additionally, their defeat does not mean that their story is over because they, like our heroes, are also on their own journeys. One Piece is not a story that waits on the main character to affect the world. Like real life, everyone has their own impact and own story. We just happen to be mostly viewing it from the lens of our main crew. The locations in One Piece are also just as, and sometimes even more developed. Oda often draws maps to assist us with understanding where each relevant character is on an island compared to their allies or adversaries, or the places that they're trying to get to in order to accomplish their current missions. Unlike most anime, where a place is just a generic setting we really know nothing about, like in a forest or random city where the fight happens, Oda takes extra special care to create locations that feel real. It also helps that a lot of the islands are based on real-world places like Venice in Italy, Egypt, and Spain. The story arcs are generally divided by the islands they visit, and it's because every island they visit is important and tells us even more about this expansive world. Every island has its own political structure, its own culture and subcultures, its own climate and seasons, its own wildlife and botanical environment. Some of them have their own religions, and some even have very specific contributions that they've made to the world economy, like a shipbuilding island, or one for weapon production, or even darker, slavery and human trafficking. There are also a variety of races of people who inhabit these islands. There are canonical fashion brands and technologies built with materials that Oda has taken the time to explain where they are derived from. There are natural and unnatural disasters that not only affect the immediate impacted area, but have an impact on the economy, landscape, and overall safety and lifestyles of other people who inhabit the surrounding countries. All of these features of this story and the world only enhance how creative Oda can be with his story. I haven't even touched on the main power system of One Piece, the Devil Fruits. These are fruits that, if eaten, grant someone a unique power, and there is only one of each type of fruit that exists at any time. Some powers are similar, for example, the Kilo Kilo fruit and the Ton Ton fruit, which allow the user to change their body weight, which is kind of self-explanatory when it comes to which is more powerful than the other. Powers in general range from the ability to turn into animals, to elements, to being able to manipulate your environment or your body in creative ways. The powers themselves are mostly simple and easy to understand, but are only limited in usage by the creativity of the characters who have them, and coincidentally, how committed they are to their dreams. The possibilities are endless. I would consider One Piece a fantasy adventure story, but Oda also has the freedom, with everything I've mentioned prior taken into consideration, to write various genres of stories within this story. From adventure and fantasy to science fiction to dystopian to mystery, action, romance, horror, historical fiction, and more. He has masterfully interwoven caricatures of cultural and historical real-life figures like Michael Jackson, Eminem, and Gandhi, and references or homages to works of art like Aesop's Fables, Dante's Inferno, and The Wizard of Oz. Truthfully, as a grown man, there is some socially instilled embarrassment that I feel sometimes going so hard for a story whose target audience is teenagers. But the beauty of One Piece is that it can be enjoyed at every age and at various levels of depth. I mean, I literally know of a baby who has watched an episode a day since the day he was born. He just turned one a few months ago, but I'm sure even the fact that it's an overall colorful series makes it at least visually captivating. One of my favorite One Piece analysts is a college professor, Dr. Philip Chase, who began his journey not too long ago and has been providing some of the most unique arc-to-arc analyses while on his journey. I also follow a millennial-age YouTuber, shout out to The Jock Show, who convinced his mom, who's a teacher, to read One Piece, and they completely shifted my perspectives and altered the way I consume One Piece for the better with their in-depth political and historical analyses of the story. Additionally, reading a story as long as I have, week to week as chapters are released, enables me to experience the story as it evolves with the times, where Oda might be influenced and inspired by real-world events that are happening in real time. There have literally been chapters that were released in time with contextually related cosmic events. The One Piece community, like its story and world, is enormous, and one of my favorite parts of it is that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people more obsessed than me about this story of a lifetime. The story is at a point right now where sadly it's approaching its endgame, but as the end draws near, Oda has been on a generational run with big reveals, answering questions we've had for decades. Legendary fights between characters whose battle prowess before now we'd only heard tales of, and a still ever developing story and world that is even deeper and more interconnected than we could have ever imagined. It is an absolute joy theorizing with my friends and strangers alike on almost every social media platform, going through multiple YouTube channels where there are creators who have dedicated a career to deconstructing and flipping the story upwards and over, because there's always something to discuss and there's always something we've missed. In fact, there's an annual live stream called The Reverie, where the most popular One Piece reviewers come together to theorize and discuss the story as it has developed over the past year. There is no other anime community with as much material or as much passion as One Piece does, and it is because Oda has accomplished what no one can. One Piece is currently the best-selling manga series of all time, the second best comic of all time, right on the tail of Superman, which is written by multiple authors and has had an almost 60-year head start. One Piece has made Eiichiro Oda a top 10 best-selling author of all time. There's a reason why One Piece is as popular as it is, and I promise you, it's not all hype. Today, I have a shelf of over 100 volumes of manga, various figures that were gifted to me, some I bought myself, One Piece art books by Oda, a cookbook containing recipes of dishes canonically prepared by the cruise chef and my favorite character, Sanji, and so much more. I've watched the anime in full at least twice, I've watched the live-action series that came out in 2023, and I've watched most of the films. People consistently ask me what makes me as joyful and happy as I am, and no, I'm not going to say One Piece. That would be corny and a little too obsessive. But I will say having something to look forward to almost every week does bring me some joy. I will also say that One Piece is a story that aligns with some of my most important and relevant pre-existing values and beliefs that I try to live by. I am constantly reminded that I have dreams and I am capable of achieving these dreams as long as I remain focused and unflinching towards them. I am reminded that I don't have to do it alone and that I should focus on my strengths and ask for, accept, and offer help when I get the opportunities to, because I truly believe we can all accomplish our dreams together. I'm also reminded that no matter what people think of me, what they think that I can or cannot do, that I am the master of my own destiny, and I have the freedom and prerogative to take whatever path I choose and to enjoy the journey along the way.